Thank you very much for joining us to celebrate both Henry Geldzahler, once described as the most powerful and controversial art curator alive, and also recognize the 50th anniversary of his renowned show at the Met. I am Mark Porter. I'm the chairman of Christie. I'm very honored to be joined by our panel tonight. Randy Borchardt in the center is the founding director of the Archive of New York City Cultural Policy. On my right is Vincent Fremont, who began working for Andy Warhol shortly after arriving here in New York. He was vice president of Andy Warhol Enterprises and the executive manager of Andy Warhol's studio. And Gary Tintro is the director of the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston. Gary had been at the Met for 30 years, leading the department that Henry once led. We have been talking a little bit about Henry Geldzahler in his various capacities as curator, friend, advisor to artists. I wanted to ask Gary how this exhibition impacted the Met's collecting of contemporary art.
I think Calvin Tompkins said it best, and I think his words were, it was an almost unimaginable storming of the gates. It was the art world south of 57th Street invades the Upper East Side.
I think I remember that, Randy, you were at that party, at the opening of that exhibition. You've described it as a rather colorful night.
You got the sense as soon as you approached the museum, and certainly once you got into it, that the museum had decided to, or been tricked by Henry into opening its doors in a way that it really never had before. Probably the first time that most of those artists, 47 artists, I think, had ever hung on the walls of the Met Museum.
While this may have been a radical event for the Met, it was a disruption of the ecosystem of the New York museums in a way.
You know, it was a huge endorsement of the contemporary field, but it was, by 1970, it was no means understood or agreed upon that large metropolitan, so-called encyclopedic or universal museums should acquire contemporary art that was made most recently. And that show really was a spectacular endorsement. And I think the ultimate echo was to embolden the Whitney and the Museum of Modern Art to do more spectacular exhibitions of that kind. What was Henry's lasting impact is certainly it was through the art of his friends, through Warhol's work, through Frank Stella's work, through David Hockney's work. That is where you see an enormous impact.
I started to get to know Henry at parties, and he was very active in the social scene, but social scene with artists.
And lest we forget, a number of these artists like to make Henry the subject of their art. Andy did, I think it was an hour-long film, virtually
90 minutes.
90 minutes.
90 minutes of Henry.
Just of Henry and Henry's
smoking a cigar.
cigars.
But Henry, that was his kind of signature. And Henry, if he didn't like something, he would let it be known. Like the portrait, this portrait, there's another version where there's very little paint, and Henry wanted to ask the question, where's the art? So Andy does this version. Get the paint strokes out. So they had a sense of humor with each other.
The few artists that Geldzahler bought for the Met was only a small fraction of the artists who we now think of as the most important artists of the period. And Gary, I was wondering if you could talk to us about why the Met, in fact, had so few shows or so few of these artists' works.
He probably felt self-conscious to propose works by his friends. And the other thing that I think hasn't quite been articulated yet is Henry was openly gay. And of course, many of the artists whom Henry supported were also openly gay. David Hockney, Andy Warhol. And I think that both contributed to the difficulty that many of those artists had at that time. I think Henry and his involvement with those artists helped catapult them.
He loved being in a position where he could open people's eyes and minds to what was going on culturally and more generally in society. His program gave out $500,000 in grants to individual artists. And then he set up a second program with a parallel purpose, which was to give money to museums to enable them to acquire the work of contemporary American artists.
You know, after Henry retired from all these things, he was devoted to emerging artists. So I think his commitment to working with artists is the thread that goes throughout his career.